I first met Gina Hayden about 4 years ago at an event she was running for the Global Centre for Conscious Leadership. And I remember how excited I was to discover that there was such a thing as the Global Centre for Conscious Leadership, let alone that it was based in London. Since then, Gina, you've published your first book, which was at the end of 2016, called Becoming a Conscious Leader. And I'm really curious to hear your views on the kinds of beliefs or cultural laws, as I call them, that you notice have an impact on leaders today. But first of all, welcome, Gina. Good morning.
Morning. Thank you, Sally.
So before we get started with the cultural laws stuff, can you tell us a little bit about your background and perhaps just a summary of how you've got to where you are today?
So I grew up in South Africa up until the age of 30, which is very interesting from a cultural laws perspective, because it came with a whole bunch of beliefs and systems and expectations. And I lived through the shift from pre-apartheid to post-apartheid. So that was very interesting. And I came to the UK when I was about 30 years old, primarily to escape the constraints of living in a country where I didn't feel that I could change the system, but that I was going to be limited and constrained by it. And so I came to the UK because I've always loved the UK, and it felt to me like a place where I could come and be who I wanted to be and do what I wanted to do with a great deal of freedom and creativity. And so for the last 20 years, I've been here. Also made this journey from a psychometrist doing psychometric testing and profiling through to being a psychologist, through to working in organizations. And so now I've been running my own consultancy since 2002 and working with leaders all over the world in different organizations on their development. It feels very much like home, both the place that I'm in and physically and geographically, and the place that I'm in terms of the work that I do.
You mentioned your move from South Africa to UK and the relevance of cultural laws to your upbringing in South Africa. What has been the biggest change that you've made in your life as a result of realising that you were living life in line with a cultural law that you hadn't created for yourself?
I remember wanting to do a master's in clinical psychology. I was living in Cape Town and I had gone to a few of the interviews at a number of the local universities. And what I became aware of was that I didn't get in, by the way. And at least one of the reasons why I didn't get in was because there was a quota system of race and gender, of who got allowed in and who didn't. And then once they'd filled the quota, then you could kind of get in on merit. And the odds were crazy odds, like I think it was something like 600 people applying for kind of 4 positions. And I experienced that, and I thought to myself, I remember driving home and thinking, this is never going to change in my lifetime. And I don't want to be constrained and limited in what I want to create and achieve in my life based on a set of laws that I didn't create, but that I was living under. And so the feeling for me was one of rebellion, I think. It was one of an urge to break out of that. And the language I now have for it is kind of author myself, to be creative, which is still a really big value for me, to create in my life and not to be constrained and limited and squashed and dampened by the weight of what felt like societal and family expectations that were just really constraining, and it didn't feel like living freely for me. I've subsequently come to learn that entrepreneurial creativity and freedom, autonomy are 2 of my deep values, alongside some other ones as well, like wisdom and unity and compassion. And I think the idea for me of living a life that was constrained by societal norms that were bigger than I was, that I couldn't change, but that were ultimately going to limit my expression as a human being. The pain of living with that was greater than the risk of stepping out of that into the unknown. So I remember sort of literally packing a bag and coming over it and starting again when I was about 30. And just with this real feeling and drive of not wanting to be limited by things, wanting to make a contribution and wanting to live a fully expressed life.
Did you face any challenges in making that change? You know, you use the words like authoring myself, and I'm sort of interpreting that as you carving out your own life and designing life as you want it to be, rather than anything that's been prescribed either by anyone else or by any sort of your own beliefs that you no longer need. Did you face any challenges in stepping into that and giving yourself permission to fully author the way you live your life?
When I look back at it, I think not. And when I ask myself, it's a good question. When I ask myself why I think not, I think it's because it comes back to this feeling rebellious point, but not being anti anything. It's more, I'm not willing to pay the price of a small life, or I'm not willing to pay the price of a restricted life, especially not restricted on the basis or in terms of rules that some historical point in time has made. So I'm really happy to live by rules that are around consideration and the common good and how we collaborate to innovate for solutions for the future, and how we lead business so that it's more of a force for good in the world. And all of that is how we all live with more of a unity mindset. I think all of that is kind of absolutely fine. I have no need to rebel against that. I remember sitting in a church when I was 16, looking at this minister, and this thought occurred to me that how does he know that the book that he's holding represents a truth, when all the other religions also have a book that they all say is equally true? So how do we know what's the version of the truth and who's right and who's wrong? And I remember it was at that moment that like the illusion of somebody having the answer just fell away. And so I think this rebellion that I'm speaking of is rebellion against the expectation that me as the creative, whole, conscious human being can be constrained by somebody else's dogma, somebody else's perspective, somebody else's point of view that they are saying is the truth. And I'm saying, but it's not, it depends, right? It depends. And I think it's that seed that I've kept coming back to again and again and again. And that is a theme in my life. Not buying into the dogma and not taking someone else's version of the truth because they happen to be in power, because it happens to come from a country, or it's just made up. It's just made up. And so how instead do we live a very authentic life, knowing who we are and creating ourselves in our lives as we want to be, without being constrained in that freedom?
So how has that manifested in your life? This belief, this expression, your creative, whole, conscious self, how has that manifested for you?
I guess the sort of modern woo-woo way of talking about it is, manifestation or attraction. And of course, there are all these words for things, and they're just words. But it does feel to me like that's some of the principle of being a self-authoring being with a lot of freedom and a lot of creative agency, is that you can shape your life the way that you want it to be if you can loosen the tethers of the conditioning that you grew up with. And I think if there was one theme for me, that's probably it. It's creating something that's more of what I want, and realizing that where I've come from is informed by history, and that who I am today and tomorrow doesn't have to be the same as who I was yesterday. There's like an internal yes. And I'm like, oh yeah, that feels, it's like buzzy excitement. And then if I take action along that path and I pursue that, not even very hard sometimes, chance meetings or just be somewhere next to someone or something like that. And then being grateful, remembering to be grateful, practicing gratitude and remembering to stay open to the next moment and saying yes to the next moment. Like, we don't actually have to do anything or very much. I think we're carried along by the river of life, and we just have this illusion that it's under our control. I think we can be in action, but it's not the same as control. And I think your cultural conditioning point is where we've given over our agency to a set of rules made up by other people. And there was a consensus about those rules. It became a consensus reality. But it's just a bunch of people with a very similar viewpoint who happen to have a tipping point of belief system. Like in South Africa, there was a view that apartheid was the way to go. How on earth did people get away with that for so long? How did they manage to control the everybody in society bought into it, and then the reality shifted? So it makes me realize that these cultural rules that we subscribe to unconsciously are just made up. They're just vapor, and they're very transient. Who we really are is this sort of expression, this creative expression behind that, of a kind of creative impulse. And I really enjoy the buzz of looking at what it is that I can create. It feels like a great buzz.
You painted quite a zen picture there of, life and the universe conspiring in your favour if you loosen the tethers of conditioning and, this sort of free flowing of the river of life. Sounds really beautiful and very enticing. Have there been any periods of time in your path of following that river where, you've come across some choppy waters?
Oh, so many. One particularly big point of waking up for me was around the time my daughter was born. So I was involved with her father, who is not a very nice person. And the set of circumstances around her birth and our relationship were very destructive, very painful. It was a very painful breaking down of my sense of identity. The things that I thought I was and the things that I thought about myself were stripped away down to the last iota, like really the last bit of me. And then actually, again, when I look back at the dots, I was sort of rescued or lifted from that situation. And she was 10 weeks old at the time, and we were kind of taken away from that situation. And although I was completely unable to think or function at the time, when I look back at it, the dots were all connecting. So, for example, I happened to be online and I happened to click on a link which was to the consciousness coaching program that you and I both know. And as I read the words, I was like, oh, this feels exactly like every word just landed with me. And then, of course, there was a course starting the following Monday, and it was in South Africa where I was at the time. And I went, and that was kind of a waking up. I remember that there's an inquiry on that course, which I wouldn't have been ready for, I think, before then. But I kind of came into the course all sort of with all of my armour on. And there was an inquiry on the first day or so of the course, which was the inquiry into who am I? And I remember the whoosh of realisation that everything I thought I was, everyone I thought I was actually just made up, was constructed. And actually that the freedom on the other side of that, for me, I could actually be creative in the moment about creating myself as who I wanted to be. And that freedom, the wish, the rush of freedom was just incredible. I think I actually stood out of my chair. It was like, oh, wow, I kind of get it. It was exhilarating. And I think I wouldn't have been able to have that particular point of awakening if I hadn't gone through the destruction of who I was. And as painful as it was, when I look back at it, all the circumstances and the dots that I look at, chance meetings and having intentions and putting my writing out there, and that going out to certain other people and they knowing other people, and then getting involved in conscious capitalism, and then getting involved in conscious leadership. And when I look at it, it kind of is all linked up, but the destruction of me and my sense of self and my cultural conditioning, my laws, it all got destroyed in the fire and keeps getting destroyed in the fire. And I think this place that I'm at now of being in the Zen places you describe is because I've learned from my first-hand experience that the more I let go of my and me and doing too, and the more I just relax and let come in what it is that wants to be expressed from me, and how am I serving, and what am I contributing, and what is my role here, and what am I being an instrument of, the more I just get back to that, the easier things are. The more I struggle against that, the less successful everything is, to the point where I think where I'm at now is I can't even make myself energetically do something that doesn't feel right anymore. Like, I have to actually just go, and you and I have spoken about this before, I just have to say, I don't know the answer, but I actually know I can't do this. And I just have to trust. And then the more I trust, actually, the more held I am, the more held we are. We actually really are held. We just forget. And I'm half expecting, even saying that, of course, something will come over the horizon that will make me have to burn another part of my undercarriage of myself, I'm sure. But again, rather that than living in the illusion that's self-created, rather that than living in the illusion that we think is real.
It's sounding like your view of tough times that you go through, that we all go through, pains that we experience. It sounds like what you're saying is they are really positive things, because they're real opportunities to sort of strip something away, or, learn something about yourself, or grow as a person, or, make a change in your life. Would you agree?
I think they're very useful things. I think at the time they don't feel positive at all. At the time they just feel like death. But I think in hindsight, I wonder whether we, just to get philosophical for a moment, I wonder whether when we hold on to ideas and parts of our identity, that's when we experience the resistance and we burn. And when we let go, it's kind of easier and there's more flow. My experience seems to echo what very wise people have said is the way things are. So that feels comforting.
Feels like this time when you were 30, moving from South Africa to the UK, that feels like quite a sort of a big shift for you and quite a big change. How different is life for you? Like your experience, not so much the day-to-day, how different is your experience of life now compared to then?
It's a beautiful question, because it's making me think about things afresh. I think my experience of life is that it's ever less about me. And if I compare this to myself before, and I think this is just a life thing, I think we just evolve in this way. When I was younger, it was more about me. And I felt that I was the source of what I created. So we spoke about more masculine drive. I felt I was the source of creating things in the world. And the feeling these days is more gentle, more held, and more of an instrument. So I spend more of my time asking, what am I here to do? And how can I serve? And I can't remember the last time I asked myself, what do I want to do? It sort of gets woven in there, but it's kind of, I think the path to happiness for me feels like asking myself, what am I here to be an instrument of? And listening into that and doing what I can to take action of that in the world. So they also asked about the feeling. I think the feeling feels more restful. definitely more peaceful. There's less worry and less stress. There's more trust, way more trust. I don't have the answers, and I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And none of us do. And I think we live under the illusion that if we control it, we're going to somehow make it happen the way we want it to happen. But I think that's just the ego talking. My chap in India that I work with made me laugh one day. He said, "So Gina, what you're saying to me is you're willing for God to take care of everything in your life except your bank statements and your daughter, because you can do that better than he can." That's like, yeah, it's kind of, the bits where I was not willing to give over control, and it's not easy. Those two things, I need to be in control. But I think the feeling of not knowing what's going to happen and trusting, there's a sense of exhilaration and gratitude, awe and respect. And it's very beautiful because things come into your life, into my life, that I'm not expecting, these chance meetings and these amazing synchronicities that I could never, ever have created myself. I could never have designed that. And this image of flying off the one trapeze in midair, trusting and hoping that there's a pair of arms from the other trapeze coming towards you to catch you. That's exactly what it's like. That's where faith comes in, faith and trust. Knowing that we're part of something bigger, faith that we're being held, trusting that we're part of life. And that the more that we resist that, the more pain we feel. And the more we flow with that, the easier things become, the more simple things become, the happier we are. That's how it feels for me, at least.
So who's in control of your bank balance and looking after your daughter now?
Do you know, what a lovely question. My bank balance is really, I'm touching wood now as a way of controlling myself. My bank balance is really interesting. So difference is, I've come from a belief that I need to be working all the time. If I'm working really, really, really hard, then I'm being useful and I'm achieving stuff. That's like a couple of decades ago. And recent is sort of 3 years ago. This feeling of wariness, of continuing with that pattern. Like, I don't want to do that pattern anymore. And then a feeling of just wariness in that work would come in that I didn't really want to do because it required more time away from my daughter. And I just said, no, I don't want to do it. And it seems crazy on the face of it because, in independent consultant, you're like, well, this is X amount of money. And, if this is £50,000, am I crazy to say no to that? But this feeling in my stomach, like my heart just dropping into my stomach like a stone and just going, I just can't do this. I cannot make myself do this. And that old rebellion feeling coming in again of, I don't know what the answer is, but I know that this is not it. And so just choosing to step into not knowing. So now you ask about my bank balance. I think the way that it's managed at the moment is I seem to have oodles of time. Like, long may this continue. Oodles of time. I have space to think. I have time for meetings and great conversations and talking to you. And then work comes in, which I haven't really done anything, I haven't chased. And somehow when I look at my bank balance, there's always kind of the same amount in there. And it's more than enough. Because in a way, I'm kind of not micromanaging it. But in a way, it's taking care of itself without me obsessing about it. It's letting go, letting go, letting go.
Given everything that you've learned and all of the experiences that you've had in your life, what would you say to your younger self?
I would say, relax. You don't have to work so hard. You don't have to try so hard. You're going to think that it's all about you. You're going to think that you have to make it okay. You're going to go through some really tough times and it's going to feel like it's the end. But actually just let go earlier. Relax and let go earlier. It's all actually okay. It's all okay. You're very loved. We are all very loved. We are all very held. We're all part of life.
Are you living life now how your younger self might have designed it?
Yes. Although my younger self didn't know what it wanted to design. So pre-20, I was wondering, what is the answer? What is the answer? If it's not in this book called the Bible, then what is the overarching umbrella that contains all of the different ways of evolving? I mean, what effectively I was doing was encountering the question of there are many ways up the mountain. Just keep going up the mountain. It doesn't matter which way you take. If I look at where I'm at now, I'm going up the mountain, and I can take any path. It's a saying that I'm very fond of that my teacher in India told me, which is, we're mostly empty space with a few stories attached. And I love that because there's a sense of freedom in that we're mostly empty space with a few stories attached, because it's true. And I think the idea of cultural laws is, don't take the stories too seriously. You can change them. They're not actually the reality of who you are. You're the empty space. We're the witness, we're the chooser, we're the consciousness behind the stories. We don't have to be constrained by our stories, whether it's cultural in a big societal sense, whether it's cultural in a family sense, whether it's just the belief and the values and the systems that we brought with us. They're just stories, and we have the power to create a different set for ourselves, or in fact to let go of them more and more and more and just be the empty space. There's to go really, really big. He was telling me, he said, if you look at it from the perspective of, just if you take a perspective out from the planet, out, you get this feeling of we're so insignificant. We're so insignificant, and we're significant and insignificant at the same time. We're a form of life, but the stories and the cultural laws, it's like, seriously? It's like completely, it's just hilariously insignificant in the bigger scheme of things. And so our lives, we come on the planet, we're here for 80 or whatever years, like this little poof, like a firefly, comes up, and then that's it. So I think it's about not getting so attached, not remaining too attached to those stories, and just letting them, and being creatively playful in the space that's left.